It's Viewpoint, your program of personalities, politicians, and perspectives. And have at my right-hand side here one of the great personalities of Golden County, Ms. Judy K. Busby, co-host of this program. Good morning, Mrs. Busby.
See, that's what happens when you oversleep, Bill. You say things that aren't true. You've got to set your alarm better.
You know, we always try to start this program with kudos, but we'll kind of emulate Gabriel Heater, the great radio announcer of the early days. There's good news today. And the good news today is that thanks to the Tabor family, and this would be our kudo of the morning, of rural Atlanta, the Illinois State Police dog that was missing has been found and returned to the custody of the state police and is doing very well. That is really good news. When I got home last night, I turned on my email messages and I saw a message from the Humane Society was telling us about this missing canine dog, and one was killed in this accident. It was a tragedy. But I was very concerned about that poor dog being out there all night. And by golly, that found that dog, and thanks to Mrs. Tabor for calling in and letting us know about that. Thank you very, very much.
And I understand that the poor little dog wasn't too crazy about whatever brand of dog food she had on hand. She had to grill some hamburgers for you.
Well, she was doing something right anyway. At least that dog is safe and warm and sound, so we appreciate that very, very much.
Now, Bill,
yes, ma'am.
How was it that you were out last night when it was snowing and all the weather was happening? Where were you?
Well,
if I dare ask.
You dare ask because you sandbagged me. You certainly did. That, in my 87 years, that's the biggest gotcha I ever experienced. So I will let you tell about that gotcha. I don't think I'm going to toot that horn.
Well, now, Chris, you'll be happy to know that Bill was most deservedly recognized at the City Council, on the City Council floor, with his accomplishments, his myriad accomplishments, and how in his retirement he probably works harder than most of us who are still employed. And it was most deserved.
Well.
And I was very happy about it. And his little wife and I went up there with him under false pretenses, I dare say. And he was very surprised. So that's fun, too.
It was, the false pretense was that I thought my neighbor and the husband of Mrs. Busby was going to receive some recognition. And I went there in support of my neighbor. It turned out that wasn't the way it was. So anyway, it was.
And then he got bonked on the head with the truth.
It was a gotcha. Anyway, the first inkling I had is when Mr. Busby first said, "The fellow that I'm talking about is older than dirt." And the light bulb then came on. I guess there's something going on out at the Golden County Fairgrounds that perhaps we should mention. That as much as they're advertising here on WLCN, Tools for Cash events going on out there this weekend. Apparently, if you have some tools that are superfluous to your needs, you can take them out there and walk away with some money for them. And I don't know the modus operandi, but we should mention that because they are spending a little money with us to tell us about this big event. So.
And what they say is true.
Yes, apparently you can walk away and take your ball-peen hammer out there and get $2.98 for it. So, or whatever the amount may be, I don't know. Now, Mrs. Busby, we've got a guy to beat up on here today.
Bless his heart.
The timing of his being a guest again is just excellent. So why don't you introduce our guy, and then we'll have people call 648-5510 and just beat the devil out of him.
Well, I think that one of the reasons that Chris Miller was hired by the Weather Service here in Lincoln was that he's such a big fellow, so he can withstand a beating. But it does seem ironic. All anybody is talking about right now is, in fact, the weather. And here we are talking about the weather, only in a little bit more official terms. And I dare say, Chris, we're having weather.
Well, the weather never stops, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And, that's one thing about the weather in the Midwest. A lot of people say, well, it changes every 5 minutes. Well, not quite that much. But it does change quite a bit, and it makes things interesting, especially this time of the year, and challenging for some folks to get out, especially when you've got the blowing snow and the cold and things like we have today.
Well, and your counterparts all the way across the country are having even more weather than we are in a lot of places. The East Coast is getting it again. This one fellow on the news said that he'd gone to bed at midnight last night and there was nary a flurry. And he got up this morning to 18 inches of snow. And this was early this morning.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, it's coming in big places.
They're getting buckets full of snow in parts of the East Coast, and they have different kinds of storms than we get here in the Midwest. They get a lot of that moisture that comes off the Atlantic Ocean, and it feeds those storms, and they measure the snow in feet.
Yeah, they do.
Out there.
Yeah, that's
when
amazing.
they get those
Just
nor'easter type storms, and if memory serves me correct, this is the third one they've had this year, which is it's not all that unnormal, I should say, to have something like that, because especially out there on the coast, there are parts of the New England states which can get a few of those each year, and they usually average more snow than we do here. If we get a snowstorm here, we get 6, 8, 10 inches. Rarely do we get anything over a foot of snow here in central Illinois. But out there are some parts that can be, it's quite common. But also because of the warm water close to the coast, if you're too close to the coast, there are some areas that get the ice or the real wet or the cold
the nasty
rain.
business.
Yes. Whereas you go a few miles inland and they've got 2 feet of snow. So
I'd rather have 2 feet of snow than the ice.
And that's what a lot of people say, and I agree with you, because it can take a while, obviously, to push that amount of snow out of the way, and it's challenging for people, and airlines have to redo their schedules and things like that.
And that's a big thing there. You mentioned that the economic impact on backups at airports is just monumental.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, that's one of the reasons why our agency, the National Weather Service, is part of the United States Department of Commerce. Because if we can, get those forecasts and warnings out there, then I'll just use the airline industry as an example. They can adjust their schedules or get people out before the storm approaches or what have you, so that they don't experience too bad of a loss. But it's such a huge travel corridor that once you start hitting the East Coast, when you're hitting Boston, New York, Philadelphia, all at the same, and even down to Atlanta, which is a huge hub, and they don't get the snow down there like most parts of the country. They're just not used to it. And when you start shutting down all those hubs, that's a disruption for the entire country. So it
It's
does
a
have
backup effect, isn't it? I mean,
it really is.
It's a cause and effect relationship.
It's a domino effect that hits the whole grid of air travel across the United States.
One other type of snowfall that they talk about regularly, like they'll say Chicago is due for 3 inches of snow or 6 inches of snow, and right across the border in Atlanta, they're due, or in Indiana, they're due for a foot and a half.
Right.
That lake effect, what is it really?
Well, what lake effect is, and I'll use Lake Michigan as the example, when a north or northeast wind comes down the length of the lake, what happens is the water is actually relatively warmer than the air. So if you have very cold air coming down the lake, that temperature difference causes clouds to boil up, which creates snow within those clouds. And then it just blows the snow into bands right down the length of the lake all the way down inland. In fact, a few weeks ago, I believe it was between Christmas and New Year's, there was some snow from lake effect that got down into our area here. It's very rare to see that, but Bloomington, Peoria, and we even had a few snow flurries from it here in Logan County, had some of the lake effect snow. So that can go quite a ways inland.
Because it got more cloud cover over the lake than it usually did, that it drifted so far south?
Yeah, the cold air going over the warmer waters of the lake caused the clouds to build up and become filled up with more ice crystals or snowflakes. And that's what it causes it in narrow bands to move down the lake. So like you said, Chicago will be on the edge of that. They could get 3 inches of snow, whereas Gary, Indiana, or South Bend, Indiana, is sitting there with a foot of snow or more.
It's just fascinating to me how you can start your day with like rain, and then that turns to a sleet, and then that turns to a snow, and then you've got yourself something to deal with.
Right. And for us, that's the biggest challenge for winter weather forecasting, and it all lies in the temperatures that are up in the clouds. And that's why daily, twice a day at 5 in the morning, 5 in the evening, we do the weather balloon launches here in Lincoln at the weather station, because we need to know what the temperatures are above the ground. You know, we know what it is here at the ground. We can measure that, and let's say it's 25 degrees, and a lot of folks will say, well, it's below freezing, that means it's going to snow. Well, not necessarily, because you can have warmer air up in those clouds. And if you've got warmer air above freezing up in those clouds, you've got raindrops instead of snowflakes. And that rain will just fall all the way down to the ground, and then when it hits the cold ground, it freezes, and that's when we get our ice, when we get the ice storms. So as the temperatures change above the ground at the level of the clouds, that dictates what kind of precipitation we'll have, whether it's sleet or rain, freezing rain, or snow.
Judy mentioned this changes during the course of a 24-hour period. I remember very well when I was a young kid in the Air Corps. I was stationed at Wichita Falls, Shepherd Field down there in Texas. And it was not unusual for you to have rain or sleet or sunshine all on the same day down there. And I was wondering about, is that a common... does it do that on a regular basis in certain areas?
In certain parts of the country, it can do that on a regular basis just because of the geography and how close they might be to a source of cold air. We see that quite a bit in the Plains states. So from the Dakotas down to Texas, that's a fairly common thing. Around here, we don't see it too often, but there was a case, and I wish I could remember what year it was, but it was back in the 1800s when areas around here were first starting to get established. There was a horrendous storm that came through. There was a massive temperature drop. It was a day in January when it started very warm, unseasonably warm. You know, we don't expect 60s and 70s in January around here. And this powerful cold front came through. And, you know, back then, we didn't have weather forecasts to tell you what was going on. And people said, you know, hey, it's pretty warm today. It's a very nice day. But by later that afternoon, a very intense cold front came through the area, and temperatures dropped from about 70 to about 20 below zero. And people got caught off guard by that. Several people lost their lives as a result. They were frozen. There were guys on horseback that were frozen in their saddles because the temperature drop was so great and they couldn't get to shelter. And it went from rain that suddenly froze, and then it was blinding snow and very cold. So, but that's a rare thing to happen around here.
Judge Stringer wrote a history of Logan County. And I think it was 1911 that he wrote that. But there were still people here at that time from the big snow and relayed their stories of it to him. And they're all reported in his Logan County history. And it was just amazing. And, of course, they didn't have a snowblower, I can tell you that. And they couldn't see their house from their barn or vice versa. And so they'd string some kind of rope, hoping they could get back and forth. And like you say, there was quite a loss of life. It was a terrible thing.
Absolutely. Big loss of life, a lot of loss to livestock, which, you know, that's how people had to subsist back in the day. So that was a real tragic storm that hit the area, one that definitely went down in recorded history.
You bet.
Those are what they called, quote, the good old days.
Not so much.
I'm not too sure about that. You know, Chris, it seems to me, memory does this as you get a little bit along the way here, you know, that our winters, they get severe here, but it seems to me that as a kid, we had a lot more snow during the course of a given winter. Would that be a trend that I might remember correctly?
That's possible. I've heard a lot of people tell me that, and I look back at some of the data we have for snowfall from around this area, and I think the difference that we have seen, and I've spoken to the Illinois State climatologist about this, is that when snow would come into the area December, January, this time of the year, once it hit the ground, it was there for most of the winter until we started to get into March. We have noticed warming trends in December and January, but not so much in February anymore. It seems like lately, the last 20, 30 years, we've seen a trend where some of our worst winter weather is occurring in the month of February. And it's a shorter winter that we're seeing in many years. Now, this winter, a lot of people might argue that we've had some winters where, especially recently, where
the snow disappeared.
But it did disappear, right. In fact, look what happened right on New Year's Eve.
Yes.
When we had temperatures in the 60s, we had severe storms. There was that horrible tornado that hit down in Petersburg area, which actually isn't all that uncommon. It's kind of rare, but it's
to have a
something
tornado at this time of year was not uncommon.
That's correct. In fact, we looked at some data from just look at the last 6 years. So we're not going to look back very far. 3 of the last 6 years, we've had severe storms and tornadoes here in central Illinois between Christmas Eve and the 7th of January. And I'll tell you why that happens. Because this time of the year, we're supposed to have temperatures in the 20s and 30s or even colder. It's winter in central Illinois. That's what we expect.
Yeah.
When the temperatures, we get that warm air that comes surging up here. And we get those temperatures that are way out of normal. 60s. In fact, a few years ago, we had a day where it was in the 70s on the 7th of January. People were running around outside. This is fantastic. All the snow's melting. But we're watching the storms very closely because when that happens, the atmosphere just wants to bring itself back into balance. It's not used to that. It's like tipping the teeter-totter one way or the other, and it's got to bring itself back into balance. And the way that happens is when these big storms erupt because of the temperature differences from what we don't normally have this time of the year. So as a rule of thumb, if we're looking at warm weather in any time in December, January, or February, and I'm talking temperatures in the 60s or 70s, be on the lookout for very powerful storms to follow that, because there's usually a cold front that's going to come through right after, and when that happens, the storms are just going to explode.
Why does the cold front follow that?
Well, when the warm air surges up into our area here, there's always a cold front, or at least the southerly winds ahead of a front is what causes that warm air to get up in here. And then without that, you wouldn't have the warm air. But like I said, the atmosphere bringing itself back into balance over the entire Midwest and the plain states of the U.S., and it's going to bring that cold air down from Canada and off the Rockies. And then we're going to get that sudden temperature change where one day we're 60 or 70, and the next day the front comes through and we're back down into the teens and 20s.
Yeah, you mentioned the fact that when the snow did hit, back in the old days, so the good old days, so to speak, it seemed to stay until spring, and then but I can remember as kids we'd build snow forts, and they'd stay a long time.
Yeah.
And of course, you don't see anybody about building snowmen right now. They're too busy watching that damn TV.
No, really, it's
all that
true.
junk out there.
It's true.
But and our fathers probably would be put in jail today because they would actually tie ropes to the bumpers of the car and drag us on the sleds down the street. Horror of horrors.
Horror of horrors.
Be so
is
stupid
right.
as to do that with your children. But that's the way it was in those days.
Sure.
Now let me ask you this, Chris. What does you folks in your profession have to talk about glacial melting? What an impact? Is there an official position on that?
Well, when it comes to the glacial melting, we see it happening, obviously. The geologists that study that look back at records, and they say that, at least from what I understand from the research, is that our planet has gone through this in the past, where the glaciers have melted and receded, and then they've reformed, and they melt and they recede, and they keep going through this cycle. We're in a cycle right now where the glaciers are receding. They're melting. They were going to melt, regardless of anything that man is doing. Now, is man having an influence on that?
That's an important thing you just mentioned right there. They're going to melt regardless of what man is doing. You know, green gases and all that business.
But has man had an impact on that? Oh, absolutely. I think from what I've seen on the research on it, it is what man has done with burning and carbon and fuel, fossil fuels and things like that. We've accelerated that process a bit. But when you're looking at glaciers moving, you're talking thousands of years. We're not talking about the last 100 years or since the Industrial Revolution. So I think we have caused that to happen a little bit quicker. Are we the only cause of that? No. No. Man-made things or emissions that since we've gone into the modern age or the industrial age, I don't believe is the only reason for this. There are a number of factors, and it's like that anything in science. Science is not as simple as saying this causes that. There's always a number of different things or reactions, especially when you're talking about the weather. It's usually not as simple, this caused that to happen. There are a number of things that had to come together for things to happen. So in my mind, when it comes to science saying it's just this or it's just that, we're not looking at the whole picture when people say that. It's a combination of things that's causing things to happen. Now, there is a lot of push out there to, we need to be careful about burning, fossil fuels, and those are limited. And all the green technologies are out there, and people have drawn lines, but that's a good thing. Is it going to make a difference as to what's already happened? No, because it's already happened. It's in the past. Is it going to help in the future? Well, sure, it could help a little bit, but in the big picture of thousands of years of glacial movements, it's going to have a little impact. Not a huge impact, but it will have a little impact. It'll be part of the equation.
Al Gore's not going to be able to stop this then?
No.
Good, I'm glad to know that.
Well, didn't at one time the glaciers come really relatively close to this area?
Oh, they did. Yeah, absolutely. There was a glacial period, I believe it was 10 or 15,000 years ago, roughly, where they pushed down into central Illinois, and that's the reason why there's higher elevations up in this area and toward Atlanta than there is, say, down in Lincoln or Elkhart or southern parts of the county, because that was the southern extent of some of the deposits from the glaciers. So absolutely, we're in, and that's one of the reasons why the Great Lakes are where they are. The glaciers carved out.
Oh, you mean it wasn't Paul Bunyan?
No. Well, maybe Lake Superior.
That ruined this Norski's
I'm sorry.
whole background there. That's her Norski background.
Yep.
Well, go ahead, Mike. Go right
I
ahead.
wasn't saying anything. I'm just depressed.
Well, we talked about the fact that the glacial warming has been going on for a long time, and then it will stop. You read a lot about National Geographic has some really neat stuff to read on that, and I presume that what those folks have written, those are all scientists, and so that's the best knowledge according to their findings at this time.
For the most part, yeah. And I look at National Geographic articles and other science magazine articles, and some of them are not necessarily written by the scientists themselves. In the journals, the scientific journals, they are. But in some of those other magazines like that, they do interviews of the scientists to get their viewpoints. And
so it's a personal viewpoint in some cases, as opposed to scientific findings. In some cases.
Well, it should be. A lot of it is based on scientific findings, but there's always that viewpoint that gets in there as well. And in my mind, when it comes to the whole climate change issue, when it became a political issue, and it got away from purely being a scientific issue, that's when we started to see some things coming out that weren't necessarily truthful or weren't necessarily based purely on science. Because when the lines were drawn as far as I'm taking this position because I'm this political party, or I'm taking that position because I'm in the other party, then that's where things really start to get gray, and people would take bits or pieces of the research that was done to support their position.
Sure. Oh, yes. That's human nature, isn't it?
Exactly. which, as I was saying, is not telling the whole story.
Right.
That's
exactly.
a funny thing. Al Gore comes to mind again.
Well, you know, when that first came out, I thought it was terribly frightening. I thought we were all going to be parboiled, and it was imminent, you know?
Sure. You know, there are some things that we do know from the research. For example, if carbon emissions are not curtailed here in the next 50 to 100 years, okay, then our great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and so on, they will be left with a planet that is going to be warmer than what we are now.
By what, though?
But that's where the scientists disagree, because some of the information they're coming out with is saying, well, worst case scenario could be, you know, as much as 10 or 12 degrees warmer than what we see today. More likely, it's probably much less than that. But even slight fluctuations in temperature can change weather patterns and things like that. So as I mentioned, you know, it will definitely help, but it's not going to be the only reason why global warming or climate change is happening. If it is even happening, it's happening in some parts of the world. Is it happening here in central Illinois? Well, we haven't seen the impacts of that.
Well, how many years ago, approximately, did this particular warming trend set in? Because we have a cooling trend, and then in another few thousand years we have the warming trend. When did this warming begin?
Could we answer that, Chris, after we take a little break? This being a commercial station, we have to earn our nickel up here, and then we'll try to answer that great question of Judith's.
Sure.